Kia ora, good morning everyone, Richwan here, welcome back to the channel. Since Viltrox announced they officially joined the L-mount alliance, a lot of us have been very excited and patiently waiting for their first L-mount autofocus lens. And today it is finally here. This is the Viltrox AF 16mm f1.8L, the very first autofocus L-mount lens from Viltrox. This is a full frame lens with autofocus and full electronic support. This is not Viltrox top-of-the-line lab series, but still, it is a lens designed for professional users and is actually one of the most feature-rich L-mount lenses available right now, with a few features we haven't seen on any L-mount lens before. In terms of pricing, it comes in at US $580 or 599 euros or 530 pounds, which is very reasonable for an ultra-wide angle f1.8 lens. To put that into perspective, it's just over half the price of the Lumix S 18mm f1.8 and about 1/3 the price of the Sigma 14mm f1.4 DGDN. By the way, this isn't actually the first L-mount lens from Viltrox. One of the very first Viltrox reviews I ever did on this channel was a Viltrox 20mm L-mount cine lens when Viltrox had just started making lenses. At the time, I thought it was a decent budget cine lens, mainly because there were not many affordable cine options back then. But the market has changed a lot since, and Viltrox has improved massively over the last few years. This 16mm f1.8 was originally released 3 years ago for the Sony E mount. I did a quick hands-on impression of that version and was very impressed. So today we'll see if anything has changed with this new L-mount version. A usual quick disclaimer, Viltrox has sent me this sample for the review, which I don't have to return, but as usual, I don't accept any money payment for any of my reviews. Okay, now let's start by looking at the image quality. All my tests in this review were shot on a 24MP Panasonic Lumix S5 II. We'll begin with sharpness. I've tilted the camera so we can also evaluate corner performance. At the maximum aperture f1.8, the center is already very sharp, even when zooming to 200%. Good contrast, and I don't see any obvious chromatic aberration either. Stopping down to f2.8, center sharpness improved very slightly. After that, sharpness stays very consistent until f11, where diffraction starts to soften the image. Now looking at the corners, at f1.8, the corners are a bit soft when I focus the image at the center. If I focus directly on the corner sharpness becomes quite decent, which suggests this lens has a bit of field curvature. When focusing back at the center and stopping down, corner sharpness gradually improves. By f4, the corners are very sharp and there's no noticeable improvement when stopping down further. The minimum focus distance of this lens is 27cm or about 10.6 inches, giving you about 0.1 time maximum magnification, which is about average. Sharpness at minimum focus distance is pretty good, even when shooting wide open at f1.8. Chromatic aberration control is very good. I only see a very small amount of color fringing even in high contrast scenes shot at f1.8, so no real issues here at all. It wasn't that long ago I used to complain about lens flare performance in almost every Chinese lens review. Thankfully, that's no longer the case. This Viltrox 16mm lens is a great example of how much things have improved. Lens flare is kept very well under control, even when shooting directly into the sun, which is even more impressive for an ultra-wide angle lens. It's not perfect. At certain angles, you can still see some lens flare, but overall, it's more than good enough, especially considering the price of this lens. Bokeh isn't usually the main focus for an ultra-wide angle lens. But since this lens can focus down to 27cm and has an f1.8 aperture, you can still get a bit of background separation when shooting close. The background blur looks surprisingly nice and doesn't appear nervous. At 16mm focal length, you normally expect noticeable distortion, but this lens performs quite well. With profile correction enabled, distortion is very minimal, as you can see from this brick wall test. If I disable profile correction, there is some barrel distortion, but the amount is still much less than I expected. For Sunstars, the 18-point Sunstars looks decent once you stop down the lens a bit, although I personally prefer the tails to be slightly longer and sharper. At f1.8, I see some Coma flare near the corner. It gets a bit better at f2.8 and disappear once stopped down to f4. So you may need to stop down the lens a bit if you want to avoid Coma flare in the photo. With vignetting correction enabled, there is still some noticeable vignetting at f1.8, but once you stop down to f2.8, it's reduced to a very minimal level. Stopping down further doesn't really change things much. Importantly, unlike some third-party lenses, there's no negative vignetting when we stop down. With vignetting correction disabled, the dark corners are much more noticeable. Vignetting does reduce as you stop down, but even at f16, a small amount of vignetting is still visible. Ultra-wide angle lenses are not the most demanding when it comes to autofocus, but since this is Viltrox's first autofocus L mount lens, I was very curious about performance. When you take photo, the autofocus is very quiet, but the speed is not the fastest. However, because it's an ultra-wide angle lens, so I think the performance is still quite acceptable. Video autofocus performance is excellent. The lens tracks my movement nicely and quietly, with smooth focus transitions. I don't notice any overshoot or unusual behavior. Focus breathing is also very minimal. If you look closely at the extreme edges of the frame, you might notice a tiny change in field of view when the focus is changed between 1 meter to 15 meters. But in real-world use is essentially unnoticeable. Aperture changes are smooth, gradual, and slowly during video recording, even when the aperture ring is not declicked, which is great. One thing I did notice on the S5 too, if I turn aperture ring quickly while using auto ISO, brightness would sometimes jump slightly. I'm not too sure if this is normal behavior. Let me know in the comments if you have experienced this. The crop zoom feature available on the newer Lumix cameras works fine with this lens. The only limitation is that you cannot assign the focus ring to control crop zoom. If you haven't tried any of the Viltrox higher-end lenses from the last couple of years, you might be surprised by how well built this lens is. The all-metal construction feels very solid and premium, easily on par with high-end Sigma lenses. From the metal lens mount to the lens hood, everything feels very well made. It's also weather sealed, including a bright red gasket at the lens mount. The focus ring at the front is quite smooth, and we have an aperture ring with a click-declick switch on the side. It is a feature I really love myself. On the opposite side of the lens, there's an AF/MF switch and 2 customizable buttons. By default, the top button functions as a standard function button, which means you can assign the function from the camera body, while the bottom button controls AB focus point in manual focus mode. This works in both photo and video mode. Right now, the AB point transition is too fast for video use, but Viltrox told me they are going to add new feature to the app which allows user to customize the AB point transition speed, which will make this feature excellent for video shooters. Both buttons can be reassigned using the Viltrox Lens App to control other features, which I will talk about next. One thing you may have noticed is the color display on the lens. It shows many information including aperture, focus distance, AF mode status, and even a depth of field scale when you are in manual focus mode. The display updates instantly and smoothly. Some information like the aperture value is a bit redundant, and I still find the aperture display design slightly odd, just like I did with the Sony version 3 years ago. But overall, the screen is actually very useful. Being able to check focus distance is especially helpful for landscape shooting as a quick sanity check. I did notice with my Panasonic Lumix S9 and the S5 too, when I'm shooting something at a close distance, the distance display on the screen is not always accurate. However, the photo seems good. We have reported this back to Viltrox and they said they will try to improve it in the future by firmware update. The screen is backlit, easy to see in bright sunlight and also readable at night. If you don't want the screen to light up, for astrophotography or maybe low profile shooting, Viltrox has thought about that too. I'll show you how in a moment. The lens uses a 77mm front filter thread, and since the front element doesn't protrude, you can use the normal front filter easily. At around 550 grams, this lens is not lightweight, but that's expected. For comparison, the Sigma 14mm f1.4 weighs nearly double that. One of the coolest features of this lens is the Viltrox Lens App, which is available on iOS and Android. When you mount the lens and turn on the camera, the lens Bluetooth feature is also enabled automatically. You can then connect to the lens wirelessly through the app. Once connected, the app will check if there is new firmware available for your lens. If there is, you can download and install the firmware wirelessly through the app, which is great and very easy. The only thing to note is that when you are doing a firmware update, you should power the lens using a USB power supply connected to the lens USB-C port rather than relying on the camera to power the lens. The reason is that the camera could time out and shut down during the update, which could cause the firmware update process to stop halfway, and that can be really dangerous for the lens. Now, I do like this wireless update method, but all the founding members of the L-mount Alliance, which means Leica, Panasonic and Sigma, they all update lens firmware through the camera body. So why doesn't Viltrox as an L-mount Alliance member follow the same method? I contacted Viltrox and asked them about this. They told me the firmware can also be updated through the camera body. The app is simply an additional option, so users can choose whatever method they prefer. And that's great, I really like that. So back to the app. There are a lot of things that you can do here, from small fun things like uploading your own logo to the lens screen, to more practical options like adjusting how long the screen stays on, or setting it to permanently on or permanently off. This can be very useful for people shooting astrophotography or for those who just don't want to draw attention. Personally, what I prefer to do is assign one of the two custom buttons to toggle the screen on or off. That way, I can leave the screen on most of the time since it's actually quite useful, but when I don't want it, I can just press a button. It's much quicker than opening the app and change the setting every time. There are also a few additional features like checking the lens serial number and other lens information. The app isn't perfect though. For example, it keeps showing me a firmware version pop-up even though I'm already running the latest firmware. But overall, I still really like the app. It gives me a quick and easy way to connect to the lens and make adjustments. When Viltrox joined the L-mount Alliance a few months ago, I was really excited. They have made some excellent full-frame lenses at very aggressive prices. So as an L-mount user, I really want to see them fully committed to the system. Now that their first autofocus L-mount lens is here, the result is pretty much exactly what I hoped for. Image quality is very good, build quality is excellent, And feature-wise, it offers everything you expect from a pro-level lens, plus a few unique extras like the display screen. Considering the price, roughly 500-ish in US dollar, euro or pounds, this lens offers outstanding value. So what do you guys think of this lens? Will you be interested in picking up one yourself? I do have an affiliated link below if you want to order one and support my channel. And which Viltrox lens would you like to see on L mount next? I personally love to see the tiny Viltrox 28mm f4.5 for cameras like the Lumix S9 or the Sigma BF. Viltrox has told me they are working on multiple L mount lenses, so I guess we'll just have to wait a bit and see.